status quo, if you want to change the status quo, you will have to struggle, right? Because people won't give up power easily. Okay. Then globalization, of course, is producing cultural mixing, right? And because it's producing cultural mixing, people are moving across borders. We are consuming media from other countries, etc. People are starting different educational models in different countries, etc. Right? Because this is happening, it's going to produce tensions, right? So, for example, when Rastafarianism comes from the Caribbean to Ghana, and students have to wear locks, you see the tension it caused in Achimota, right? So it's causing tensions, right? And this is the caution I want us to leave with, right? That sometimes, because of the tensions that are caused because of cultural mixing, what we call moral panics are created, right? These are exaggerated claims about it's all doom and gloom once this is allowed, right? So, for example, when the Achimota thing happened, I heard people say this will create, doom and gloom sort of, they're creating these exaggerated scenarios, right, around what might happen if this was allowed. Of course, the students have been going to school, nothing has happened, right? So these moral panics are always exaggerations, right? It come out of this fear of difference and change. Okay. So what I want to do now is just briefly sort of define a few things, right? So it's always good to define terms that we are using, and just, so that we are kind of on the same page about how I'm using these terms. So, culture has meant different things, right? And continues to mean different things for different people, right? It's come to mean the idea of having taste and manners, right? You have culture, you have manners, right? These days, I don't know whether any of you have seen the influencers teaching people how to sit and how to eat with a fork and knife. It's hilarious to me, but anyway. Then we also have culture meaning artistic expression. And sometimes when we use this culture, we often mean this definition, right? Culture as taste and creative expression. Then we also have culture, and usually when I use culture, I usually mean this definition, right? Which is the whole way of life. Everything we do is culture, essentially. And in Ghana, we have a peculiar way we invoke culture sometimes, where we use culture to mean some past tradition, right? And every time I hear people do that type of thing, they are always ahistorical. And by that, I mean, it's not even accurate, the way they are invoking culture, right? Okay. And then by globalization, I'm essentially talking about the current moment we are in, right? Globalization is by all means not new, right? The Portuguese landed here in the 1400s, right? So globalization is essentially not new, but there's something new about this moment of globalization we're in, right? Where our ability to travel, our ability to consume media information across time and space is instant, right? So I can sit here and call somebody in the US, right? There's something instantaneous about the way globalization operates, which is unlike in the previous periods of globalization, right? So there's something new. So that's what we're talking about. And then when it comes to the question of development, there have been various approaches, right? So one of them is to think about development in terms of modernization theories, which understood that development was underdevelopment, for example, in Ghana is mainly caused by the conditions in Ghana, right? It's because, Ghanaians have backward culture. They don't have, national nation building institutions. And the only way they can be developed is they have to emulate the Western countries. Now, this is a discredited idea, but I'm sure most of you will bear with me that it still remains a very present part of the way we talk about development in Ghana, right? Even though it's discredited. Then we have another sort of main way of thinking about development that offers a more critical way to understand why countries are underdeveloped, right? And this takes development into the terrain of politics. So modernization just sees development more as a technical problem. Give them the right tools, let them come out of their cultural backwardness, and then they'll be developed. But more dependency says no, development is a political issue, right? And really, the reason why countries are underdeveloped is because of their relationship to the more developed countries, right? And therefore, questions of exploitation, etc., come in. Okay. Now, the new iteration of thinking about development, that comes out of 2015 Sustainable Development Goals by the UN is essentially an idea of development that says, right, the idea is we need to think about, meeting the needs of the present generation without compromising the needs of the future generation, right? And simply the central goal here in thinking about development is making sure that there is intergenerational equity and also fairness, right? I don't know whether any of you heard about the young people who sued their government over the climate crisis and saying that the government had a responsibility to ensure that they were protecting them against the impending climate crisis, which is already here for some countries, by the way. Okay. What I want to do now is just quickly shift to thinking about the way we talk about identity, right? And there are various ways we often talk about identity. Maybe some of us have noticed and some of us haven't. Right? The one way we think about identity sometimes is think about identity as sameness, right? There's something inherent within us that makes us the same. And that thing is always fixed and never changes throughout time. And sometimes when you hear people in Ghana say our culture, this is actually what they mean, right? They have this construction of identity as an unchanging thing throughout time, right? And therefore they have this idea that because we are this, then all of us who belong to this social group have these collective identities, right? Now, this construction of identity, often what it does is that it tries to produce a sameness, right? That often excludes or silences its internal others, right? So when we think about the Rastafarian boys who were denied admission, these are the internal others that are being silenced, right? Even though they are Ghanaians, right? The schools say, they need to be or look the same, right? They are silencing their marginalized identity because of their faith and the way they wear their hair, right? Then there's another way to think about identity, which I think it's more productive, which is to think about identity not as a fixed thing, right? Something that is always there, but it's always changing, right? It's never complete, and it's fragmentary and contradictory, right? I know I'm throwing out several words, but let me give you an example. So, for example, I'm currently in Ghana. I'm Ghanaian, right? I'm Ghana, right? When you travel to, let's say, the US, for example, you become an immigrant, you become African, right? You are primarily identified as Black, etc., right? So the idea is that, depending on where you are, your identity is inflected in a different way, right? So we have these several identities that we always carry with us. It's never one thing. It's never finished, right? I'm a youngish person right now, right? But then in the next, few decades or so, I might be a pensioner, right? What does that pensioner identity hold for me and how I navigate the world, okay? So it's never fixed. So there are a few ways people have thought about identity in the current stage we're in, where some people call it the neoliberal globalization age, right? And by neoliberalism, what they essentially people mean often when they invoke that term is that we're living in a world where people believe that the way we structure the society should primarily be governed by the markets. So let the markets decide who gets healthcare or not, and how that healthcare is distributed, etc. Right? So two ways of thinking about this that often dominate the conversations is that because of this neoliberal globalization, it's going to lead to what they call cultural imperialism, where we all become Americanized, right? And essentially what people also argue is that you often have cultural products flowing from the north to the south. And then it might lead to homogenization, right? We are all becoming westernized. And I'm sure some of us will bear witness to the anxiety some Ghanaians have about the so-called moral decadence of the West, shaping Ghanaian identity and how this is a horrible thing, right? So, yeah, and you have various responses to that, and we'll get to that conversation as well. And then you also have people who say, well, this neoliberal globalization, because it's leading to cultural mixing, In fact, what it's doing is creating hybrid identities, or it's leading to hybridization, right? Where people are a bit Western, but they're a bit Ghanaian. They listen to Beyonce, but they also listen to Sarkodie, right? Things like that, right? So the idea is that they have this cultural mixing, and their hybridization is going on, right? And I like using this KFC example because, you when you go to a KFC or a McDonald's or in the US, sometimes the menu is tailored towards the local space, right? There's an adaptation process that goes on. And so you won't see shito in a KFC in the US, right? But you see shito in Ghana, right? Because they have to localize, right? So globalization always has to localize, right? So therefore, it's not just purely the West dominating, but then there's some localization that has to take place. I think somebody's mic is on. Okay. So I wanted us to kind of think about this. Yeah, even Jollof. I wanted us to think about this with this quote, right? And I love using quotes, but my students hate it, but bear with me. So this is from Stuart Hall, somebody I really like to think with. And he says, how are people from different cultures, different backgrounds, just give me 1 second. Different backgrounds, different languages, different religious beliefs produced by different and highly uneven histories, but who find themselves directly connected because they've got to make a life together in the same place, or digitally connected because they occupy the same symbolic worlds. How are they to make some sort of common life together without retreating into warring tribes, eating one another, or insisting that other people must look exactly like you, behave exactly like they think, exactly like you? That is to say, cultural assimilation, right? So this is the challenge, right, that globalization poses to us. How do we live together, various religious beliefs, various histories, etc., without falling into cultural assimilation, right? Without saying you have to be assimilated into the dominant cultural space, which is what the secondary school rules intend to do, right? It's to dismiss difference and essentially create sameness, right? And it's an artificial sameness, right? It's an artificial sameness. So one of the things that happens is that globalization can lead to a very dangerous defensive form of nationalism, right? Where people say, this is not our culture. And I'm sure some of you have heard it in recent discussions around the anti-gay bill that's going through Parliament, right? This is not our culture. So people are becoming defensive in their national identity, right? They want to hold on to a particular past, right? A particular idea of where they come from. And this type of response is rigid, right? It tends to fall back into this rigid definition of identity. And oftentimes when you engage people and you tell them, well, if you go back into our history is more complex than and more nuanced than you offer, right? But then, they are selective in what they pick, right, to make the argument of what their identity should be, right? So if you think about it, what they are doing is really falling back into this idea of identity as a fixed thing that never changes, which is not true, right? Our identities are constantly changing. Okay. Then there's a way in which another response, which some may argue is more productive, where difference is incorporated into the status quo, right? But sometimes the way that difference is incorporated, it doesn't really change the system, right? It's just incorporated into the system in such a way that it still maintains the system. And one way we can think about this is through the notion of representational politics. And sometimes and you can use the argument of like what a boardroom looks like. So maybe a boardroom typically would look very masculine, full of men, right? And then the boardroom becomes diverse, women are added. But then the function of the boardroom really never changes, right? In the way it operates and the way it treats its workers, etc., right? So the status quo doesn't change, right? But then there's sort of a superficial use of diverse peoples, right? To make it seem like there's diversity, but just having a gender balanced boardroom does not necessarily mean that the boardroom may have progressive ideas for workers, etc. Right? So that necessarily might not be the case. Okay. Or sometimes it's used to just assimilate marginalized people, right? So for example, I have this picture of Burna Boy, and one of the reasons I put Burna Boy up there is, if you think about it, the global music industry hasn't shifted or changed that much with the rise of Afrobeats per se, right? The systems and structures are still the same, but then it's incorporating different sounds and voices from all over the world, right? But what we want to get to is, how do we engage with difference so that it becomes transformative? Okay, that's where we want to get to. So I'm winding down, and I'm hoping folks have questions so that we can have a fruitful discussion. So I'm thinking about how do we address the question of living with difference, right? And for me, it's a political issue, right? I don't see addressing difference as a political issue. By that I mean, somebody benefits from the status quo. And if you want to change the status quo, people will push back, right? Because they will lose that benefit. So it's a question of politics, right? So it involves, fundamentally for me, dealing with the economic and political dimensions of living with difference as well. So for example, you build an office and you want to make sure your space is accessible to persons with disabilities, for example, maybe people who need to use mobility devices. Of course, it may cost more to build a ramp, right? But you have to invest in that ramp, because having people access your building is important, right? There's an example from the Ghana Fire Service a few years ago where they dismissed 2 women who got pregnant for some reason, right? And the women had to go to court and fight the fire service to be reinstated, right? And what's the rationale behind this, right? Okay, because people don't want to invest, right, in making their institutions accessible and inclusive, right? Why not, right? Because there's some economic investment that has to be made in this project, right? Which comes with some political will as well. And then, engaging this question of difference also means that you need to transform systems and structures, and you have to dismantle some, right? Some of them no longer exist because they are incompatible with the sort of society we want to build, a democratic society that recognizes the dignity of everybody, right? So those systems and structures may have to go, right? And people benefit from those systems and structures, so they'll push back, right? And there's a thing in Ghana we do where we often tout ourselves as being a very peaceful people. This is not really true. We have a level of tolerance in the society that easily becomes undone in moments of crisis. And we see it, for example, in the hotly debated conversations around Wesley Girls. It almost turned into a serious religious crisis, right? And so we have this fragile peace, right, which masks a lot of injustices that a lot of internal others have to endure, and we don't often understand when the pushback occurs, we act surprised, right? It's because the peace that we enjoy is very fragile, right? It's very, very fragile. Okay. So for me, to deal with questions of inclusion and creating space to live with difference means that people have to fight. And people have always been fighting, right? Space won by marginalized people did not come handed on a platter, right? They had to fight for it. They had to fight for laws on sexual harassment in offices, in workplaces. They had to fight for laws around disability access. People had to fight for inclusion. People had to fight to be counted, right? And so it's going to come through struggle, right? It's not going to come through a kumbaya type of dialogue. It's going to come through struggle. And, I went to the pensioners picketing, And some of the people who were at the pensioner picketing, when I spoke to them, some of them were senior people in the government or in civil service. They had drivers, they had access to all sorts of things, right? But once they came on pension, they lost all that access and power, right? And so it's interesting to see them now resorting to civil disobedience as a way to assess their rights, right, and fight for what is due them, right? And so sometimes we forget. And one of the things they told me was, you the young people, you're healthy, you're walking about, etc., etc. Once you go on pension and you're not able to really walk well, you need to go to the hospital. You start thinking about questions of accessibility. How many public forms of transport in Ghana can accommodate a wheelchair, right? I spoke to a person who uses a tricycle to move around, and he told me that one time he was traveling to Kumasi and he had to pay for 3 extra seats to accommodate his tricycle just so he would get to Kumasi. So this one person, right, had to pay 4 times what an able-bodied person would pay because he simply has to use and move around with his tricycle, right? This is not an inclusive society, right? This is not an inclusive society. Okay. So I want to end, and I'll come back to that flyer soon, but I want to end with this quote from Cornel West. And he calls on us to have a deep coming together that does not homogenize our specificity, but uses our differences in a way of deepening communion and community, rather than deepening domination and subordination. Okay? And just a shameless plug, because cultures is integral to how we think about difference. A friend of mine is hosting a exhibition on the 25th May, and he's dealing with questions of police violence across the continent and in the diaspora. And these are also questions of living with difference, because one of the things you'll observe is that the police have been used as a tool of exclusion sometimes, right, to protect particular kinds of classes. So how does that occur, right? When do you become the target of state violence, etc.? But one of the things he does is he uses spiritual, artistic techniques from the Volta region, specifically ever artistic spiritual practices. And so it's really interesting thinking about that in terms of questions of difference as well. Okay, so thank you very much, and I hope we have questions.
Thank you so much, Nii. You give us a lot to chew on. Please type your questions in the chat box if you have any. So Nii, I hear you say that cultural diversity, right, is essentially about bringing people from different backgrounds and cultures together and creating an environment that does not only recognize the differences between those cultures, but also celebrates them. Do you think it's possible to actually go beyond tolerating? I think you mentioned something about tolerating. Do you think it's actually possible to go beyond tolerating to actually celebrating other cultures in an environment like ours, especially in situations where we feel like someone else is imposing their cultural values or someone else is imposing their way of doing things on us? Do you think we can do that as Ghanaians, celebrating other cultures without necessarily feeling like we are being forced to?
Yeah, that's what we have to do, right? We have to move beyond tolerance. Tolerance is not useful. Yeah, tolerance says, well, I'll allow you to pray here sometimes. But then remember that I'm still in charge, and I'm because I am the majority, I'm giving you permission to do that, right? But like I said, it has to be transformative as well. So for example, if you have a school that was founded by maybe some of the missionary institutions, and you've become a public institution now. So therefore, you're catering to the public. And the public consists of many people from various religious persuasions, and some people who are not religious, right? How do you shape your curriculum and your practices to ensure that you are respecting the fact that some people might be Muslims, some people might be Buddhists, right? Do you build a mosque for them, right? Do you have an imam they can see, right? So for me, then the institution transforms into an inclusive system versus just tolerating, right? And because it transforms, what it does is it allows a more thoughtful appreciation of difference, right? Where then we don't become necessarily antagonistic per se. I always like using this example. You know, you sit in a public bus and then somebody just gets up to start preaching, right? It's quite common. A lot of people, somebody might put in headphones to tolerate that behavior, right? Somebody might get upset, people just become used to it. It's been normalized. But imagine a traditional priest getting up to start performing libation on a bus. Like you can imagine how somebody would get up and say, hey, oh yeah, juju, something like that, right? And so for me, as soon as these move, like what happened at Wesley Girls, it just tells you that we're living in a space of tolerance. And this idea of peace is just a fragile form of peace. And if we don't do something about really moving beyond tolerance and deeply living in a transformative, inclusive society, it's very easy for the tensions to flare up and cause further crisis. Yeah. I hope I answered your question. I kind of went around a bit.
Yeah, yes, you did. There's a question in the chat box. Someone says, please, can United Nations law superimpose national laws, or to say a global law overpass a sovereign nation's rules and conduct?
Yeah, I don't. First of all, Ghana is not a sovereign nation. Let's just get that out of the way. Okay. Ghana is not sovereign. It never has been, right? We've been working towards it. We sort of gained some kind of political independence, but we've never had economic independence, right? So the IMF is here dictating to us how to shape economic policy in Ghana. Ghana is not a sovereign country, right? So let's just get that clear. We've never been sovereign. The point about your government went there to go and sign treaties, right? Your government went there and agreed to particular forms of treaty. If your government didn't do that, it wouldn't be bound by the treaties it had signed, right? For example, the United States is not a member state to the International Criminal Court. So therefore, the International Criminal Court doesn't have jurisdiction over in the US, right? Russia is also not a signatory. Ukraine is also not a signatory, right? So there's no jurisdiction. But your presidents and your political figures went there and then agreed. They signed the charter, they signed the treaty, and therefore there is some responsibility that falls on them to abide by the things they agreed on, right? But Ghana is not sovereign. That's just the plain truth.
Okay, so the second question is, what's your take on saying prayers before the start of corporate events?
They should stop.
That's another question from the chat box.
They should stop. They should stop. It's a very intolerant practice, right? What you should do, or you could easily do, is before you start the program, you just tell people to observe their religious faith quietly for the 5 minutes, and then we start, right? And then if people want to pray, they can pray. If somebody wants to call on their ancestors, they can do that, etc. Right? It's an intolerant practice. And this is, if you think about it, you're actually forcing your religious practice on somebody else, right? It's not uncommon to see a lot of our Muslim friends who know so many Christian prayers and quotes and practices. And most of our Christian brothers know and sisters know very little, right? It's because, of course, the society is always very, very Christianized in that sense. So much of our public life is Christianized. Right? If you walk onto the streets, if I go to Medina Market sometimes, there's a street preacher on almost every corner, that you hardly see a priest doing that, right? So if you think about it, the Christian calling on evangelism actually does a lot of this forcing onto people, right, that we often criticize others of doing. Yeah.
Bunny, when you look at a celebration like Independence Day, right, where you have different prayers being said. So the traditionalists will come and say their prayer, the imam will say their prayer, and then the Christians will do this. Don't you think that that's an avenue to kind of celebrate the different cultures? Isn't that better than stopping altogether? If we stop, let's say I'm raising my kids as Christians, how do they know what a Muslim prayer is like? So
right.
that if someone in their class is, say, Muslim and they're praying, like, how wouldn't they have a problem with that person? If they've seen it on national TV, then they know that, okay, there's a group of people who are Muslims.
Right. But that's why the educational systems should transform, right? So, for example, Wesley girls could have used the Salah opportunity as a way to teach the entire school about Islamic traditions and practices, right? And have a deep conversation about where these practices came from, what is the fasting about, etc. Right? But then they said no, they shouldn't do it because of health reasons, right? And so the educational institutions are a good place to kind of delve deep and let people know what other cultures and practices do. And I agree, but remember when Mills came into power, he banned indigenous prayer activities. He banned it. Even though we had this practice of doing the Muslim, Christian, and traditional prayer, he banned the traditional prayer, right? And he could do that. Why could he do that, right? He could do that. Imagine if he wanted to ban the Christian prayer. Imagine the uproar, right? And that's why I say we live in this fragile space of tolerance, right? And we think we live in a peaceful society, but we don't. There's so much violence that goes underneath that tolerance. Yeah.
Okay, so there are two other questions in the chat box. What is your view of gentrification, taking into consideration stance on social inclusiveness?
I haven't really studied the concept of gentrification well, but the way we often use it sometimes in Ghana means, and I hope I'm getting what you're saying correctly, is the idea that you have these high-rise neighborhoods coming up that are pushing out working class people, etc. Right? And so that's how I often see it used in Ghana. But it's a Western concept, so I really haven't delved into its history properly. But to answer your question, if that's what I'm getting from your question, class is also a very important way of thinking about inclusivity, right? And so why are we building a society where it's high-rise apartments in the hundreds of thousands of dollars? Meanwhile, you have people living in shacks and kiosks and things like that. And children, right? This country talks a lot about protecting children. Ghana doesn't like children. You go, like when it's 3:00, go outside and look at the way children go back home from school. You cry. It's so scary the way they are crossing busy highways, the trotros they have to sit in and safe. Ghana doesn't like children, So we are building this society where inequality is on the rise. Last time there was a report that says the number of millionaires in Accra had gone up, right? You see more fancy cars than before. There's all this, but then there's all this inequality and poverty also rising alongside that. And for me, class is an important part of how we think about inclusion as well. Yeah.
Okay, there's one more. Do we have to embrace every chance just because other countries have accepted it? How do we know when it is time to change our culture to accommodate other cultures?
We will know. How when other cultural people migrate to your country and you see that they have different cultural practices that are not harming people, right? Then you have to sit back and understand that you have to build an inclusive space for them as well, because they are here. Just like the way Ghanaians go to other countries and then they open African stores and start selling Kobe and things there, right? They can do that, right? Because there's a space for them to be included in the society in that way, right? It's a very limited inclusion, but there's opportunity for that. The point about do we have to embrace, I don't know what you mean by that, right? Sometimes it's organic, right? It's based on the media we consume, the songs we listen to, and not all of it is useful. Some of it is harmful, and therefore we have to, address the harmful parts, right? And you take the good parts and you leave out the harmful parts, right? But what we don't want to do is start criminalizing, using the police and the prisons to immediately start stopping things we don't like, right? That's very dangerous, because one of the things you realize is that once you start doing that, it's not somebody's mic is on. Once you start doing that, it's easy for those types of things to be extended to other groups. Sometimes you think that because you don't like a particular group, whatever they are doing to that group is fine, right? Because it's just them. But that's not the way power works. Give it a few years, it will extend to you very soon. Yeah. Somebody has their hand up.
Yes. My question is that one school of thought has it that Ghanaians are inherently racist.
Hey,
can you give us, or I can give examples that shows that.
Please give me examples.
Okay, the Achimota example, for example, right? It clearly shows that Ghanaians, when we flip the other coin, we can be racist even to our own selves, right? So therefore, why then do we then complain that other cultures or other countries are racist towards our own people? How can we cure that?
I see the point, yeah. Well, I mean, remember that Achimota is an institution. Remember, Achimota is supposed to be a place where elite Ghanaians go so that they become leaders in the future. So already it's a very classed space, right? It's a very bougie space for producing a certain class of people who were born to rule. So it's not accidental that it has the most presidents coming out of that institution, right? So that's on the one hand. So it's already a relic of hierarchy, if you think about it that way, right? It's already a space that excludes people it considers undesirable, right? The point about the hair, it definitely has racial features or characteristics associated with this idea of the rule against long hair. And this type of rule is not even unique to Ghana, right? Recently in Malawi or so, a Supreme Court ruled that the teenagers could wear their hair. Also in the Caribbean, they also had the issue with the Rastafarian kids as well. So, and all of us what do we have in common? All of us were colonized by particular European powers, the UK, Britain, right? And so there's a colonial history there that we haven't really addressed. There are a lot of colonial laws and rules and practices embedded in our institutions. And once you start seeing it, right, it's there, right? So we have to do the work of really dismantling and transforming systems to remove some of those colonial things. And so, I mean, I wouldn't go as far to say that we are inherently racist, right? But we have internalized, right, racial ideas about ourselves and others, right? And that comes with even our educational system. When you pick up a book, it says the positive effects of colonialism. And I always tell people that if somebody wants to steal something from your house, let's say your fridge, and then they build a ramp so that they can slide your TV out, your fridge out easily. Then you turn around and say, oh, because they built the ramp, it's a positive effect of the stealing. There's a way in which we teach our colonial history that also doesn't help us move beyond these racial ideas that we've internalized, right? And that work through the systems as well. So I take the point you're making, right? But I think there's a history, right, that undergirds this. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Nee. I don't think there are any more questions in the chat box, and I don't have any more questions for you.
No, Agbina.
Yeah, this was a thought-provoking discussion, and I'm sure a lot of people would go back with a few things to think about and ways that we can be more inclusive as a society. I'll invite Sheena to announce any upcoming events, upcoming SPE D I May events, and then we can close.
Thank you,
Sheena.
Yes,
okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Nee, for that really insightful presentation. I think James's point also was in line with his question. You remember you showed some of the headlines where Ghanaian traders were protesting Nigerian traders. So maybe it's probably why he was also asking that question, because we are nice up to a certain point. And then when we feel you are taking over what belongs to us, then we turn around inward. Thank you so much for your presentation. We have a tech talk coming up. The specific date hasn't been announced yet, but we encourage everyone to be looking out our various social media handles, and then it will be posted. But the very next program we have as SPE, Society of Petroleum Engineers, is a sip and paint on canvas, which comes off on the 9th of June at Ngoni. This will be at 6 p.m. We'll share the flyers very soon so that everyone will know how much it costs to do, because there'll be it's a paid event. It's not free, so the cost will be out very soon. And then on the 24th of June, we have a football match between all the other companies within SPE. So we have the Petroleum Commission, NPA, GNGC, MODEC, TALO, and GMPC, and several other companies that will be joining us in SPE to play football on the 24th of June at 7 a.m. at the Mother Mary venue airport. The flyers are already on our various social media pages, so let's kindly follow up on this. Yeah, now that's all from my end. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Sheena. Thank you all so much for making it to today's session, and we hope to see you in our next session. Enjoy the rest of your day and have a lovely weekend. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.